Ready? Okay, great. Okay, hi everyone. So my name's Claire, and thanks Mary Ellen for inviting me to come and speak to everyone today. I'm one of the co-founders of Extinction Rebellion, and I've got a background in fashion, ethics, sustainability. I guess also kind of partly in creative activism, but mostly professionally my background's always been in fashion in various ways. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the fashion industry and about the part that fashion's playing in the problems that we face in the world today, and also tell you a little bit about some of the work that's happened through XR, which has been specifically focused on the fashion industry and fashion systems and where that's going, because I think it's, as a cultural piece of work, I think it's extremely interesting. So I guess my kind of beginning with being interested in the environment or worried about it goes back to the CFC crisis, the ozone crisis. When I was at school in the 90s, we got taught about the holes in the ozone layer, and they taught us about the fact that CFCs were a catalyst. They went up, they reacted with ozone, they broke it down. The same molecule could react again and again and again because it went through multiple chemical reactions and ended up going back to what it was to start with, so it would just go on, and it would create these exponentially growing holes in the atmosphere that were going to kill people. And obviously as a child I thought, shit, that's scary. And at the same time they taught us in our science lesson when that science was learnt about, and that was in the 1970s. And so when I look back on that as a young person, I definitely thought, what have the grown-ups been doing with this knowledge, and why don't we run our societies or our economies or our businesses or anything in line with science? Why has it taken, the best part of 30 years for anybody to start to actually properly phase these things out of consumer products? And it didn't make any sense to me. And I guess that was a realization that sort of hit me much later on, but it was the learning it then that sort of lodged it in my mind so that I would have access to it later. And then when I studied fashion, I wrote my dissertation about the impacts of the industry on the environment, because in my mind as a child, and as a child of the 80s and all of the sort of anti-litter campaigns and people talking about landfill and rubbish, I used to just think, one day the whole world will be a landfill site. That's the only logical conclusion for constantly digging holes and burying things that won't decompose in them. And I guess at some point when you become a teenager and then you get to adulthood, then you think, well, it can't possibly be what I thought when I was a kid, because surely the world doesn't work that way and everyone seems to accept it, so there must be something that's actually pretty okay about what's going on, and that must be the limited perspective of a child, if you see what I mean. And it's not, is it? Actually. So thinking about my practice and then learning how to make clothes very well and learning about how the industry works, I guess it felt quite a vacuous place, potentially, the fashion industry. And I'd always been in love with textiles and clothing and self-expression, and how the fashion industry sort of dances around with the music industry and everything. It sort of feels like a cultural space, it feels like a beautiful place. But it became increasingly obvious to me that it was going to be quite difficult to work in that industry with any sense of purpose. So I wrote my dissertation about the impacts, and it was quite a sort of science-based dissertation, which really just looked technically at what was happening to the process of producing and disposing of polyester, for example, or what's happening in the cotton industry. And I found, a universe of obscenity, basically, which throughout my professional career just continued to get worse the more that I learned. And at that time, I had some tutors who told me that it really wasn't interesting to think about what something was made of, because if somebody couldn't see that it was organic from a catwalk, they wouldn't be interested in it. You couldn't possibly attribute something like that to a value that is associated with style or with clothing. But I found this guy on my travels called David Brower, who famously started Friends of the Earth, and he had this phrase that had been used very often. There's no business to be done on a dead planet. And when I sort of researched him, he was talking in a way which I think people would be forgiven for thinking that he was part of Extinction Rebellion, and he's been having these conversations really recently because the rhetoric is kind of the same. And given how long ago that is, it's extremely alarming when you do this kind of historic research. He talked about how we were stealing the future from children by running the world the way that we are, and how running our economies the way that we are. He talked about compassion as a necessity to be able to do anything useful about this. And a lot of what I was reading at that time in the sort of, I guess, largely quite sort of like 60s and 70s kind of green philosophical stuff around design, people were talking a lot about recognizing the interconnection of everything, realizing that our freedoms are bound together, our environments are bound together, our biodiversity is all connected. And then looking at the fashion system and looking at the power relations and seeing that actually this entire space seems to be built on ideas of domination and exploitation. And in some ways the fashion industry is an extremely useful thing to look at if you're interested in the environment, because it's like it's an industry that you can use as a lens to put on the world, and you will see many of the problems within it. I don't know many of the sort of most major issues that I am trying to face in this work that can't be looked at by using this space. And that's because it's entirely reliant on fossil fuels. When you look at any shop that's full of clothing, it's full of polyester, it's full of nylon, but it's also full of cotton. And big agriculture is entirely dependent on fossil fuels. It's also traces the lines of colonial history, and you can see it directly through production supply chains. It's also a place where you can see great inequality between genders. You can see lots of exploited women. You can see lots of racism. You can see globalized racism. You can see racism on catwalks. You can see it in magazines. And so it really is I think it's a very useful space, basically, for us to be able to not only look and see problems, but also to see potential for things to change, because it often can lead cultural conversations in quite radical ways, and it has done in the past at certain times. So in the UK, we throw away more than 300,000 tons of clothing into landfill every year. There's about 100 billion garments that are produced on this planet every year, and given how many people there are, I don't know who the fuck buys them. It's an enormous percentage of them that are either burnt or just buried straight away because they're not even used. And on top of that, a lot of people I know, because I've worked in textile recycling, throw things into recycling processes with the tags still attached. They've never been worn. And so thinking about how we're exploiting living systems and we're exploiting human communities in order to produce all of this stuff, and knowing that there is water and soil degradation and desertification that's caused by some of these industrial practices, and then thinking through kind of like how the CEOs of big corporates are actually sort of incentivized to bankrupt the living world and bankrupt their own systems in order to like give money back to shareholders and bankers that basically don't add anything into the system but are legally allowed funds, kind of throws a lot of questions into kind of how you face such a vast problem as this sort of interconnected industrial kind of global system. And in the early days of XR, we were I don't know what word to use, offered a meeting with Michael Gove, and I went and I did shake his hand, and that's, you know, take one for the team. And he said in that meeting, unprompted, something which I thought was extremely interesting, because it was a very smooth manoeuvre from him, but nonetheless he did say it on camera on the record. I think him saying it meant that it was harder for us to say it and be in any kind of like opposition to him, which I presume is some kind of great political skill that he has. But he basically said to us, we've had this economic system for years and years and years, which has been extractive and destructive and exploitative. And moreover, it's based on debt, and debt-based economies don't just bankrupt the next generation, they also bankrupt the living world. And so we know that we need to move to a different system, and we need to move to a more circular system, and we're part of the living world ourselves. So when we do violence to the living world, we're hacking at the tree of life and doing violence to ourselves. Of course, I was in some shock listening to that come out of his mouth. But what's interesting to me is that everybody then sort of says, let's go to circularity, let's have a circular conversation. We need a circular economy. And in terms of the fashion sector, they love the circular economy conversation. Fashion system loves it because basically everything fucking stays the same, apart from the fact that you recycle plastic. And they have no systems to do that. There's no recycling at scale that can deal with the mass of waste and disposal that we're creating through our systems. The polyester sector, just as one case in point, on a growth trajectory, wants to double in the next 15 years, if at all possible. That's its kind of stated aim as part of a growth-based economic system. And everybody's very worried about plastic pollution at the moment. And I think very few people know about microfiber pollution and what comes off polyester clothing and plastic clothing that gets washed. And even more than people don't understand how much plastic is going out into our rivers through our washing machines and into the sea and into the fish and then into our bellies, I think they don't understand that whilst we're campaigning against disposable plastic packaging, there is twice as much polyester polymer that gets turned into textile fibre than there is that gets made into plastic bottles, for example. And so the scale is really important for people to get to understand, I think, because it's completely enormous. And so through the work of Extinction Rebellion, obviously we've gone out saying we're facing hundreds of millions, if not billions of deaths, including people who've not yet been born. I don't think that they'll ever forgive us for our failure to act with the information that we have quite easily to hand. I also don't think that people will forgive themselves if they look back and realise what damage things like cheap clothing have done to contribute to this crisis. And the kind of benevolent planetary conditions that have given us the possibility of creating a globalised economy that we have now, with all of our reliable weather patterns, with all of the stability that we've enjoyed up until relatively recently, when things have started to clearly change, I think needs to be recognised. And I just heard somebody saying young people won't know what's changing because they never knew what it was like before. And so I think there's an enormous weight of responsibility on people of all ages to be able to reflect on what they've seen in their own lifetime. And we really tried to start XR with an ethos of facing up to loss and grief and acknowledging what's been done and having the kind of courage to admit that there's a responsibility that falls on us just by virtue of us being alive now and knowing what we know now and breathing now. So for me, there's been no question about whether or not to take some kind of action, but there is always a question about how, of course. And XR did some quite interesting work through fashion itself. So at the beginning of XR, we realised that disrupting cultural events was a kind of, traditional place to go for doing non-violent civil disobedience. So we decided to disrupt London Fashion Week. And as a hub of kind of elitist, exclusive culture, we wanted to go to that space and say, if you walk into London Fashion Week today, do you think that there's a problem in the world, or do you think everything's fine? And if you walk into that space and think everything's totally fine, there's a problem, and that's not okay. particularly for an industry that has such enormous weight of responsibility. So we went several times to disrupt the roads outside London Fashion Week, and we wrote to the British Fashion Council and said, we're going to come and be disruptive, and hopefully it will make some people miss some shows. That's the point. We'll be in the street, we'll be non-violent, we'll be respectful, we'll take a traditional approach. And Caroline Rush and some other people who are like the top people from the BFC met with us at 2 days' notice just before Fashion Week, which I found quite amazing because I'd never met her through my work in trying to, do good work to transform the industry or anything like that. But if you say you're going to go and spoil everything, they talk to you, which is worth paying attention to. We went to speak to them, and they allowed us to kind of explain our rationale, and we parted ways, and they later invited somebody back to give them a talk and all of that kind of stuff. So the engagement kind of carried on, but we went outside, and people glued themselves eventually to doors and all sorts of things. And there were interesting headlines in the fashion journals, like, is Extinction Rebellion out PRing fashion itself? Because basically, if you can make a spectacle that looks interesting and it feels zeitgeisty, then the fashion industry shits its pants, because it's entirely based on being relevant. It's demands for it to remain culturally relevant, and a culture of relentless newness. And so that was extremely interesting. Then I had a funder for XR who is from the States, and he had a friend at Gucci, and he said, basically, my friend at Gucci wants to know what you guys are going to do. He said, when you meet them, can you ask them what they want, because I know they're fucking coming for me. And at the same time, we had the CEO of H&M make an enormous PR disaster, in my opinion, in saying that youth activists were going to destroy the lives of garment workers by campaigning for people to shop less and to save the environment, which is an interesting moment for him to decide that he cares about the women in Bangladesh, frankly. Another element of the work that took place was this boycott, which was started by our friend Iggy, who's no longer with us, unfortunately. And he was an activist who just felt at a loss, really, I think, for the sort of consumption of fashion products and the waste, and thought that we should try and do a boycott. So at the same time that this boycott got launched, which was let's try not to buy any new materials for a year, I was approached at a festival by somebody from Oxfam who said, would you sign up to this thing? We're trying to get people not to shop for a month. And again, we were deeply criticised in some quarters for beginning a conversation that would take work away from some of the most marginalised and poor workers in the world, in our sort of global fashion production system. But I thought it was extremely useful to not only begin another element of that, which was about repair and care and share and buying secondhand and all of that kind of stuff, but also to begin that very difficult dialogue, which actually has been a real problem in the fashion space, where if you campaign against shopping, you're against workers. This is a serious problem that we have to deal with, because we can't be pitted against one another. That's not how this is going to go well, of course. And so what was interesting was it sort of led us into the coronavirus times, and watching what happened in the fashion space through COVID was also predictably horrible. Lots of shops were closed. Interestingly, on the week in April in 2020, that was precisely a year later than we'd closed it down with that big pink boat in 2019, all the shops were closed, every single one of them. And people had been saying to us a year previous, do you know how much money you've lost, Philip Green? Do you understand how much sales people have lost in these high street shops that you're outside of? And literally 12 months later, the doors were locked, and indefinitely as well. So you can see when there's an existential crisis that it's not impossible to stop shopping, which is really useful, I think, on reflection. But what we saw in that time was obviously an immediate halt to business as usual, and then the rights and the well-being of the people who are further down the chain were held entirely in the hands of the few who run the fashion system in an extremely exploitative manner. And of course, lots of bills didn't get paid, lots of orders got refused and dropped and cancelled, and lots of people lost an enormous amount during that time. We also saw a price drop on products, which probably will have led to much increased child labour problems. So there are people that I know that work on that specific issue in the textile area, and they said when this kind of thing happens, a lot of the work we've done to reduce child labour in supply chains, they all come back, because that kind of work has taken a long time to build up, and when there's a crisis in the system, bad practice just comes straight back up. So the only other time that I'm aware of a significant drop in consumption of fashion product is around 2008 and 2009, and we all probably remember what happened then, and that makes sense then to ask the question, how on earth could you reduce the amount of material throughput and the amount of consumption that people are making without a severe crash which causes abject harm to people throughout systems. And there's an academic called Dr. Kate Fletcher who's written a book called Earth Logic, which is a guide for fashion researchers and sustainability professionals. And she's one of the fashion academics who was the first to actually just say growth is our problem. And when she did so, I went hallelujah, like somebody is going to go and do a keynote speech and say that. But it felt like a real shift for somebody with a profile to go and say that. And in her book, she basically says that in terms of the planet's capacity to regenerate natural resources, and obviously these kind of estimates are also always very blunt, the fashion industry is too big by an order of about 4 times. So by her estimation, we need a 75% material throughput reduction of our current fashion system, when what a lot of it wants to do is double in the next 15 to 20 years. And it feels to me like a fairground ride or something, that everyone was going for a long time. We don't know how to stop. Like, can someone fucking find the button and just stop it? Because we think that we might need to get off. And when that happens through something like COVID, there's an enormous potential which has been entirely squandered as far as I can see, to be able to reimagine and rebuild things from a place of, okay, well, we've been disrupted now, so there's something else that could happen rather than just trying to build back to normal. And now the energy crisis and the cost of living crisis, I think, are helping us to see that the climate crisis is a part of a sort of very, very big social and political interlinked, globalized story, but they're all kind of part of the same story. And it feels to me like those people who are in power, who are holding the main levers of power, at least at the moment, are by holding the responsibility of managing the resources on Earth at the moment, they are deciding the future of life on Earth communally. And I don't think many of them really hold that responsibility in their hearts. Either they don't admit it, or they realise but they don't want to face up to it, and they don't know what to do with it. And in this country, the scale of political corruption that we're facing is I find quite mind-blowing. I don't think I've ever seen anything like it in my life. What's happened in recent months and years, the exceptionalism that is held by a lot of the people that you can see in these positions, I think is an enormous problem that prevents people from being able to see either that they hold any vulnerability themselves or that they've got any responsibility to deal with it. And I've been I've been on the record saying that they don't just lack the courage, but they also lack the creativity to work out what needs to be done in our times. And XR was set up with this kind of view that you give power to people by obedience, and so there is a deep virtue in disobedience, and particularly when you know that you're part of a society that's self-terminating effectively, and the people that are running it know that, and they're still putting their foot further on the accelerator rather than trying to talk to everybody about what we should do about it, then we also have a duty to be disobedient. And we also know that when people come together to talk in deliberative spaces and discuss what actually should be taking place instead, that if you pull the right people into a space that is diverse, that is reflective of a system or a community or a nation, society, that they make kinder and fairer and more radical decisions than people in power are ever able to do. And so the idea of XR having this third demand, which is for a citizens' assembly, was really, for me, the most radical part of our movement. And because it said we don't want to win power because we know the answer. We want to build people power so that ordinary people can find the answer together. And when you do that, there's not just a fairness to what comes out, as far as I can see from the examples that have taken place, but there's also like an enormous amount of social capital, of cultural credibility that comes with that, which isn't something that one individual can do when they have to do something radical in terms of policy, in terms of legislation, in terms of change. And there's also like a soothing of it for me, which is that if you've ever seen what happens to people when they go through a deliberative political process which has an outcome of deciding that something progressive or more kind and more fair at the end of it, that they find their common ground, the people who've been inside that process have also been transformed themselves as individuals as a result of sitting round a table with someone they disagree with for days and days and days on end and finding something that they can all be happy with, and they can all say, well, I was part of making that decision. And even if it's not exactly what they want, but it's going in the right direction, they still feel they can own it because they were part of it. And so being able to bear witness to all of that is really important. So we started to say, well, what does the fashion system need? It needs for the industry to sit together and face itself. And we haven't pulled this off yet, but I do still think that it would be a brilliant thing for us to do, which is to organise an industry-wide, somewhat sortition-based, so random selected assembly of people where execs and designers and garment makers and even farmers and people who work in the textiles industry all sit around with people from the petrochemical sector who feed it, from the DuPonts, from the big chemical industry where they produce the dyes and the fabric softeners and all of the things that go into this industry, and to get everyone to sit around and face the reality of our times and say, what do you think we should do with this industry? Because it's obviously some parts of it have got to be dismantled, and how could we do that in a way which doesn't cause enormous pain and suffering, and where people could do it in kind of solidarity with one another, basically. Anyway, the people who worked on the fashion campaign at XR have started a new ish. It's been around a little while, but they started a newish kind of piece of work called Fashion Act Now. And we were very lucky to meet this wonderful anthropologist, Sandra Neeson, who's been a kind of decolonial scholar for a long time. And she helped shed a new light on the conversations that we were having about degrowth. Because we were like, well, if the fashion industry could get into the idea of reducing itself, which sounds ridiculous, but it's not more ridiculous than starting a rebellion against the British government. Everyone told me that was ridiculous. We did manage to do it. So if the fashion industry could become culturally interested in transitioning and converting itself and changing through leading on a cultural kind of footing, really, then what would become possible? And often a lot of the conversations about what should happen in fashion come through industry conferences that are run by big businesses, and there's elephants in the room everywhere, and nobody really can open up these kind of very radical dialogues. So we decided to start to talk about degrowth, and Sandra came into those discussions, and she brought with her this paper about fashion and cultural sacrifice zones. And I think it's really useful. We talk about sacrifice zones in the environment sector a lot, right? Like, you go to a place, you bankrupt the natural resources, you possibly kill people that live there in order to be able to do it, you don't tidy up afterwards, you don't apologise, you extract all the money and then you just fuck off. And it's seen as a legitimate way to do business because that place is worth sacrificing to the people in charge of the business plans. And she had this quote from this guy, Hopkins, which I thought was like the most useful quote to describe what's going on with kind of globalized racism, and particularly how it relates to fashion, I think, where he said, you can't have like modern capitalism without sacrifice zones, and you can't have sacrifice zones without disposable people, and you can't have disposable people without racism. And that's just all you need, right, to equip you to go and explain to people in a really obvious and simple way. I'm so grateful to him for putting it with such clarity, because often I think it can be hard to explain to people, or why, you know, you say the fashion industry is racist to the average person, and they go, well, why? I mean, what are you talking about, you know? And so we need these kinds of communications to be clear and to be able to go out and I think speak to everybody that we know, because everybody does wear clothes, and this is why the fashion sector also is so important, because it implicates every single person who's walking around wearing something in some ways. And out of that degrowth conversation came a new term, which is about defashion. And so relating very much to these ideas about like how racism, you know, supports the systems that we have. What Sandra said, which I think was really interesting, was that fashion is creating these cultural sacrifice zones. So we have a thing that our teams are now calling fashion with a capital F. So it's the fashion system. And the fashion system means like jeans, it means sportswear like we wear, it means blazers, it means tailoring, it means shirts, it means t-shirts. It doesn't mean saris. It doesn't mean other systems of dress, which everything else basically gets downgraded to a form of either traditional dress or craft. And a lot of the way that we sort of infer these kinds of different like names that apply to different types of ways of getting dressed totally demeans all of them, apart from the ones that we're producing in order to fill our landfill sites and in order to send our waste around the world and get it sold on the sidewalks in poorer countries all over the place. And so recognizing fashion as having cultural sacrifice zones, I think, is a really interesting way for us to take ourselves maybe for a moment away from the environmental and the material and the scientific, and away from carbon and away from soil and away from the impacts on the ground, and say, actually, there's something here that's like only belongs to humans, and that's our culture. And when you see it as obliterating culture, you see it in a different way, in a much more humanized way. And I think there's a usefulness to extracting ourselves from our usual conversations about the environment, not because it's not important, but because there's something else happening here, and it's to do with ourselves and it's to do with our humanity. So I guess what I want to close by saying is that I think we need a united front of workers and the environment sector, and that's not necessarily going to be easy in terms of getting everybody to face up to the reality and to join together for the climate and social justice kind of movement to all know itself as one space. I'm very worried that the fashion industry won't change until the breakdown of systems forces it to. I hope that we can do something that can help to manage some change in a way which protects people. And yet I do sort of deep down, looking at the data, know that these cases in the past where people have managed to reduce consumption have always been attached to crisis and massive problems. It's worth saying that I think we're like on the cusp of a global agricultural crisis that I think most people aren't seeing coming. It's probably going to be exacerbated if it hits us really, really soon in a severe way through the war in Ukraine, but it would be coming anyway. It's just that geopolitics is probably going to speed it up a little bit. But in farming you have a hierarchy of need usually, and it's food first, feed next, and fuel next, and fibre is number 4. So I don't know how many people in my industry and how many students in my industry really understand the volatility of the fibre markets that they're going to be asked to work with if they think that they're going to carry on working in this space with new materials. But it does have to change, and I hope that it can, and I think that in part non-violent civil disobedience still has a place in affecting change in the fashion sector as well as in the broader political response to the climate crisis.